The title of my presentation is A Modular Theoretic Approach to the Japanese Writing System, Possibilities and Challenges. Hold on a second. Yep, sorry, some hiccups here. Yep, introduction. Oh, hold on. Sorry, there's something wrong. I'm very sorry about this. Why is this appearing here? Okay. The starting point of my presentation is the modular theory of writing systems, which has been developed by Neef based on studies in German and other European writing systems. Oh, sorry. This is the theory of phonography and phonographic systems, which are based on the sound systems of individual languages. The modular theory provides a general framework for capturing the relation between written representations and phonological representations. However, it remains an open question whether this theory is also applicable to so-called logographic systems, which are widely considered as fundamentally different in function from phonographic systems. If positive, we would have a uniform framework for analyzing and also comparing typologically different writing systems. To explore this theoretical possibility, I will present a partial analysis of the current Japanese writing system. As will be elaborated later, Japanese employs a complex mix of both phonography and logography. As such, it can be seen as an example of highly logographic system. So, this presentation addresses two main questions. Is the modular theory applicable to highly logographic systems like Japanese? And what does it tell us about logography and its relation to phonography? Discussing these questions may provide a new perspective on commonalities between different principles of writing. My presentation has four parts. In part one, I will develop the motivation for using the modular theory to look into Japanese and other highly logographic systems. Parts 2 and 3 discuss three modules of this system within the framework of the theory. In part 4, I will turn to the discussion of logography in Japanese. Some abbreviations are used in my slides: MT for modular theory, WS for writing system, and JWS for Japanese writing system. I will also use some notational conventions as shown on this slide. Part 1, modular theory and the Japanese writing system. As mentioned earlier, the main concern of the modular theory is phonography and phonographic systems. It makes two specific assumptions about language and writing system. Firstly, this theory assumes a non-derivational and surface-oriented conception of linguistic theory. Language has several different levels, and with regards to individual words, the most relevant ones include morphology, phonology, and phonetics. At the phonological level, the phonemic form of each word is defined in the underlying representation, and its actual pronunciation is computed in the surface representation. The word is physically realized as a sound wave at the phonetic level as a result of the movement of the vocal tract. The modular theory models phonography in terms of the correspondence between the elements of the surface phonological representations and the elements of the written representation. The benefit of this approach is that it allows an analysis of writing systems without endorsing particular theories of phonology and morphology, which often result in very different and even conflicting conceptions of writing and writing systems. The second important assumption of the modular theory is that writing systems are divided into two major types, namely phonographic and logographic. Whereas phonographic systems are based primarily on phonological units like phonemes and syllables, Logographic systems are considered to be based on morphological units like morphemes and words. The purpose of this presentation is to explore the possibility of applying the modular theory to the study of logographic systems through an analysis of Japanese. Some people might be puzzled by the idea of using a theory of phonographic systems to look into logographic systems. However, I assume that there is at least one very important commonality between these different types of writing systems based on different principles of writing. This assumption comes from an observation on the Japanese writing system. Specifically, texts written in Japanese can be vocally read out in a regular and consistent way, regardless of whether individual words are written phonographically or logographically. Hence, one can say that there is a common phonological aspect to both phonography and logography. What I am attempting to do here is to focus on and magnify this common ground rather than highlighting the differences. Turning now to the specific claims of the modular theory, 3 different modules are posted to account for phonographic systems. We will elaborate on these modules in next 2 parts of the presentation, but let me give you a general picture here. The first module is the language system, which gives a basis to writing. The second module is called gʁafematics, which defines correspondences between graphs or graph combinations and phonological units. The third module is orthography, which determines the conventional spellings of individual words. Orthography is considered optional, which is indicated by the dotted line in the diagram on this slide. So far, I have presented an outline of the modular theory, and I have also attempted to develop the motivation for applying this theory to the analysis of logographic systems like Japanese. With these points in mind, let us now take a close look at the Japanese language and its writing system. Part 2, Japanese language. To repeat myself, the modular theory assumes language system as one of the main modules of phonographic systems. Neef already explained this notion in his keynote lecture on Wednesday, so let me just briefly highlight one point. Traditionally, language is considered to have 2 main elements, namely the grammar or the regular properties of the language, and also the lexicon, which contains anything irregular. According to the modular theory, each phonographic system is based on a particular language, and all information about both grammar and lexicon is potentially available to that system. We can assume the same notion for Japanese and presumably also for other so-called logographic systems. This is justified by the fact that we can read and write the words and sentences of Japanese and other languages in a more or less regular and consistent way. This slide summarizes the main features of present-day Japanese. In the interest of time, I'm not going to discuss these features in detail. So let's move on to part 3, gʁafematics and orthography in the Japanese writing system. You will recall that the other 2 modules assumed in the modular theory are called gʁafematics and orthography. To see what they are and how they work in phonographic systems, let me illustrate with the spellings of homophonous words pronounced vowel in the German writing system. To begin with, the gʁafematics of German defines all the graph-to-sound correspondences allowed in this writing system. For instance, the letter W is associated with several phonemes, including V and F. There are some restrictions as to which phoneme should be chosen over the other in a particular context. We have similar rules for the letters V, A, L, and so on. Now, if we had only gʁafematics in the German writing system, we would end up with various possible ways to write the phoneme string val. It can be WAL or WAAL or WAHL and so forth. This set of possible spellings is called the gʁafematik solution space in the modular theory. We will briefly come back to this notion later. Despite the wide variety of possible spellings, in reality, there are certain conventional ways to write different versions of val in different spellings. For example, WAL should be used for whale, but not for choice or for the name of a river. This is determined by specific constraints defined in the orthographic module. According to the modular theory, orthography is divided into two subtypes, but unfortunately we don't have the time to discuss them in detail today. What is important here is that we need both gʁafematics and orthography to account for how words are read and written in some phonographic systems like German. Without orthography, it would be impossible to tell why a certain spelling should be used for a given word. Now, do we need to assume both these modules to account for the Japanese writing system? I would say yes, but with some modifications. Firstly, I propose the notion of a multi-component gʁafematics for Japanese. To write this language, the current norm is to employ a mixture of several distinct scripts. If you look at the sample on the slide, this short sentence is written by mixing 4 scripts called kanji, hiragana, katakana, and romaji. As you can see in the table here, excuse me, these scripts differ from each other in the historical origin, the number of graphs, and the main types of linguistic elements they are used to write. Importantly, this mixed use of scripts is the norm rather than an option in the current Japanese writing system. Therefore, unlike in the example of German we saw earlier, for Japanese, it is necessary to assume a unique set of graph-to-sound rules for each of these scripts. That is, one for kanji, another one for hiragana, and so on. This observation motivates us to posit distinct components of the gʁafematik module in this writing system. In the diagram here, this notion is schematically represented by the graph box for each script. I would also propose, I hit the wrong button, I'm sorry. I would also propose a multi-component orthography for Japanese. As we saw in the German example, orthography filters all possible spellings of a given word and chooses one specific spelling as the well-formed representation of the word in question. I think this notion is also applicable to each component of gʁafematics in Japanese. The table here shows some of the general and word-specific spellings observed today. We wouldn't be able to account for these word-specific spellings without positing orthography as a body of constraints for correct writing of words. These examples indicate that there is a unique body of orthographic constraints for each gʁafematik component in Japanese. In addition, we also need another body of constraints that applies across the components of gʁafematics in Japanese. There are 2 reasons for this. Firstly, Kawashima observes several conventions applicable to the different components of gʁafematics. They include the functional division between scripts, which we saw earlier, as well as the text orientation and other aspects of writing in Japanese. These conventions are best characterized as constraints on the actual use of gʁafematics to read and write texts as opposed to individual words. Secondly, Joyce and Masuda's recent paper presents an insightful discussion of the interchangeability of scripts in Japanese. In a nutshell, it is widely accepted to write the same Japanese word in a different scripts for stylistic and other purposes. This may also be viewed as an orthographic constraint, which allows rather than prohibits a fungible use of different scripts. So this diagram shows how orthography works in Japanese. Firstly, the auth box in each script represents the body of constraints applicable to that particular script. Secondly, the long box at the bottom represents the constraints applicable across the scripts. These points taken together, I propose a multi-componential structure for both gʁafematik and orthography in the Japanese writing system. This modified model is not only applicable to this system, but not only applicable to this system, but also needed to account for its multi-script architecture. We might be able to assume a similar model for the analysis of other writing systems, but this possibility remains to be seen. Now, let us move on to part 4, phonography and logography in the Japanese writing system. It will be recalled that the modular theory divides writing systems into phonographic and logographic systems. While this dichotomy is widely assumed in the literature, there are some other views on the relation between phonography and logography as well. Excuse me. This raises the question, is the dichotomous division a valid notion? We have already had insightful talks on this issue by Sven and Gordian on Wednesday, and also by Zef yesterday. But let me discuss it again with a focus on the current Japanese writing system. When we look at the values of individual graphs and graph combinations in Japanese, it becomes clear that there is a notable difference between kanji and other scripts. Specifically, graphs and graph combinations correspond to sound meaning units in kanji, but they correspond to sound units in hiragana, katakana, and romaji. Some examples are given in the table on this slide. For kanji, the first graph corresponds to the phoneme string I, which conveys the meaning love. Likewise, the second one corresponds to koi, meaning romance. This is in contrast with the examples for the other scripts, which represent sound units conveying no specific meanings. To go one step further from there, the sound meaning units represented by kanji can be seen as morphemes. A morpheme is usually defined as the smallest form associated with a certain meaning or function in a particular language. There is reason to believe both I and koi meet this definition. So we can regard the two kanji graphs in question as representing morphemes. This is not the case in hiragana and katakana, which represent the phonological unit of mora or co-syllable. Similarly, romaji represent individual phonemes, as well as phoneme strings constituting letter names. It is crucial to note that this difference in the types of associated values between kanji and other scripts is not a static one. The right-hand side of this table shows other values which differ from the typical value type of each script. Specifically, sometimes kanji graphs may represent phoneme strings rather than morphemes. Conversely, hiragana graphs may represent morphemes instead of moras or co-syllables. Romaji may also represent morphemes instead of phonemes or phoneme strings. Incidentally, as we have already heard from the other presenters in this conference, this sort of switch between phonography and logography is also observed in many other writing systems. This observation has two very important implications. Firstly, the Japanese writing system is only partially logographic, or more precisely, morphographic. Secondly, the division between phonography and morphography should be seen as a dynamic one rather than a static one. Thus, I think we need to rethink the validity of the traditional dichotomous division between these two principles of writing. One might argue that we can at least characterize the kanji component of the gʁafematiks as being morphographic. Coming back to the same examples in this table, it seems plausible to say that the two kanji graphs do represent morphemes. At the same time, we have also seen that kanji graphs may also be used phonographically. I'm sorry for the noise. In light of these cases, would it be appropriate to say that kanji graphs typically represent morphemes? One strong argument in favor of this notion comes from Joyce's discussion of two kanji compounds, that is, Japanese words written by combining two kanji graphs. According to Joyce, each kanji graph corresponds to a particular morpheme in most types of such compounds. Joyce claims that there is just one type of two kanji compounds where this graph-to-morpheme correspondence does not hold. As these words are relatively small in number, it might appear reasonable to say that they are an exception to the largely morphographic nature of kanji. Nevertheless, there is reason to believe that kanji are best characterized as representing morphemes by way of phonology. I do agree that kanji graphs correspond to morphemes in many words, but this is dubious in many other words with varying degrees of what is known as compositionality. To use an analogous example from English, one can safely say that the word blueberry is composed of two morphemes, namely blue and berry, as it denotes a berry whose color is blue. In comparison, the degree of compositionality decreases in gooseberry. Although both goose and berry are real morphemes in English, we don't see any bird in the fruit. And what do we do with cranberry, where cran does not convey any discernible meaning? As these examples indicate, it is not always easy to decide whether a seemingly compound word is actually compositional or not. The same can be said for two kanji compounds in Japanese. Some words have a higher degree of compositionality than others, and it is not clear whether we can apply the same notion of morphography to all these words. Contrastively, it seems tenable to assume that all kanji graphs or graph combinations are related to the phonological properties of morphemes. This is because all kanji written words can be vocally read out in a regular and consistent way. Following these and some other considerations, I have recently proposed to view all kanji graphs as corresponding to the phonological properties of individual morphemes. This way, we can capture how kanji graphs relate to morphology without regard to whether individual words are compositional or not. So how can we model these different views on kanji within the framework of the modular theory? If we assume Joyce's morphographic theory, we need to retain the dichotomous division of phonography and morphography. This division would be attributed to the difference in the types of graph values defined in the gʁafematik module. To pursue this direction of argumentation, we need a more refined morphological analysis of kanji written words. The second possibility is to assume my view that morphography relates graphs to morphemes by way of phonology. To illustrate, there are a number of kanji graphs corresponding to the syllable do in Japanese. In the modular theoretic terminology, we have a large gʁafematik solution space for this particular syllable. We can assume orthographic constraints stipulating which graph should be used for which word. So use this graph for do in budo or grape, but use that one in kokudo, national road, and so on. The switching from morphography to phonography and vice versa can be viewed as switching on and off such constraints. More research is needed to assess the plausibility of these two models and also their applicability to other writing systems. This brings us to the end of my talk. In this presentation, I have discussed the potential applicability of the modular theory to so-called logographic systems through a partial analysis of the current Japanese writing system. Here are the questions I set out at the beginning and my tentative answers to them. Is the modular theory applicable to highly logographic systems like Japanese? My answer is probably yes. Regarding Japanese, however, we need to slightly remodel the gʁafematik and orthographic modules and also to rethink the concept of logography. And what does the theory tell us about logography and its relation to phonography? My answer, logography, or more precisely morphography, is in a dynamic relationship with phonography. Both are used in Japanese and in some cases interchangeably. The modular theory allows different interpretations of morphography, which require further investigation in the future. In conclusion, I think that the modular theoretic approach to the Japanese writing system does provide a new perspective on the commonalities between different principles of writing. Further investigation in this direction is needed for more elaboration. Here's the references section. If you are interested, I'm happy to send it to you. So, ご清聴ありがとうございました。Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Keisuke, for this very interesting, very elaborate presentation. I have a question by Gordian Schreiber.
Hello, Keisuke.
Hello, hi.
Question regarding slide 22, if you could maybe jump back to this one.
Yes.
It was, yeah, exactly this one. So you analyze Budo and Roman as phoneme strings, and I was wondering if it's not maybe more appropriate, at least if we put weight on the analysis of the contemporary Japanese writing system, so viewed in a synchronic perspective, to maybe analyze these as morphograms instead, because they don't seem to be productive in any way. So neither the bu nor the do and the other two, not really either, I think. So why do you keep the analysis as a string of phonemes? Because of course, like historically, it all makes sense to have it like this. And I think it was Zev who has added a bit of history on this word, but why keep this view in the contemporary Japanese writing system?
Yeah, that's a good point. So for the firstly, the background is for Budo grape, the two characters were originally created to represent the syllables in the Chinese original word, and both characters were imported into Japanese. Now, because there is no reason to believe Budo can be analyzed into different morphemes, these two graphs can be interpreted as either representing the syllables, one for each syllable, or the other option is to see them together as a unit digraph, which represents a morpheme. And yes, Gordian, you are right. There's no reason that these must be, or there's no reason we must see these graphs as representing phoneme strings. They may be interpreted as morphographic digraph. And for Romanticism, these two graphs are more productive than Budo. Low waves, man, slow or slow-paced. These are used in many other words, but in this particular combination, they represent the first character, the first syllable, the second character, the second syllable. And in this case, we don't have the ground to see this combination as a digraph representing this particular morpheme, because firstly, we can do phonological analysis, and we can find other cases where these characters are used.
So synchronically speaking, would you make a difference between this case of Budo and, for example, Aisatsu on the other hand?
Aisatsu is another interesting case, which means to greet in Japanese. The word is written by two kanji again, and each character has the meaning to push. You don't push people when you greet people, but this comes from the Zen Buddhism tradition. So there's no clear part to whole relationship between the two characters and the whole word represented by them. Aisatsu, however, the characters are not used in any other contemporary words in Japanese. Therefore, I would see them as again, representing syllables, or functioning as a digraph representing a morpheme.
So this case would then be different to Boudot. And I'm just wondering, how much do we really need this original meaning or the characters, as you called it? But that's maybe just a question you don't really have to answer it. Just
yeah.
a question.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a very good point. Thank you.
I have a question by Dan Harbour.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, morning. Thanks for this. So I've been told to be quick. I'm wondering, you're pursuing analogies, as is common in this field, between linguistic theory and writing theory. Allosomy, that's to say, contextually conditioned meaning, is a major topic in linguistic theory. And it seems to fit in here. I can't quite put my finger on where, but have you thought about whether you want to have some way of incorporating allosomy of characters into this kind of analysis?
Sorry, I missed the last part.
Have you thought about whether you want some way of incorporating allosomy of characters into your treatment of the Japanese writing system?
A glossary.
Allosomy. So
Sorry, yes.
allo, changeable, semi, meaning.
Oh, allosomy. Okay, yeah, sorry. All right. That's a good point again. My short answer is no, or not yet, but yes, I definitely need to think about that.
Okay, I'd be really curious to see how it works out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
We are very short of time, but I cannot avoid asking this question. On this slide, you're showing this Romaji H, pronounced HE, so being a morphogram.
Mm-hmm.
In most fast foods, I have seen next to hamburgers with double meat, the letter W.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering, is this a morphogram for saying a double meat, or is it phonetically, is it homophone to double?
Mm-hmm.
And so is it a morphogram or some kind of homophonous phoneme? Homophonous?
Yes, yeah, thank you. That's a very interesting case. The letter W is used for double, which comes from the English word double. And yes, normally the letter is read as W in Japanese. And so the difference between W and W makes me to think the double interpretation should be seen as a morphographic function. But of course, there is a, how do you say, link between phonography and logography in that case, I think.
Okay, thank you very much for
Thank
this
you so
very
much.
interesting talk. どうもありがとうございます。
ありがとうございます。